We have talked about quantity, quality, and the final question that we wanted to ask in this plenary session is, so we have farm impacts on groundwater supply, we have farm impacts on groundwater quality. We know things need to change, and they need to change primarily at the farm level. However, that's going to be steered from the outside or from the inside by regulatory agencies, by consumers or others. And I'm inviting Gabriele Ludwig with the Almond Board of California. And you know that almonds are being shipped all over the world. We're the only people in the world that are producing producing almonds, almost the only ones. So almonds are from California, but the almond industry, California's almond industry, is engaged globally and has recently engaged in a sustainability initiative. And the question that we're posing to Gabriele is, how do you get the farmer to do things right? Welcome, Gabriele.
So, good morning. I do feel like we've gone from the big global to the national and to now the really parochial. As Thomas was saying, almonds are only grown in the Central Valley of California, United States, and it is about 80% of the production. And I'm going to try and talk about how growers think. And coming back to that analogy from yesterday, there are several co-drivers in the audience. So we have several almond growers and other growers in the audience. So in case of emergency, I will ask them for their personal opinions. Beware. And then I also just wanted to sort of add two things for that larger perspective that I don't have in my presentation, but I think are relevant to the conversation just now. And that is, where do foods fit into the diet? Every diet that everybody's supposed to be eating is high in fruits, vegetables, nuts, olive oils. What does California grow well? Exactly those things. What is California? Primarily a Mediterranean climate. That means a limited water environment. And California produces about 50% of the fruits, vegetables, and, well, nuts almost 100%, but for just the United States. So just to give you a sense of when we look at what we want people to eat, but where those things grow well, that doesn't necessarily match up with this nice theory of how things should be distributed in the world, okay? So just keep that in mind. And I think one other little detail to note when you look at these FAO and big global data, the way yields get talked about are really different. Just to give you an example, on tree nuts in California, almonds, your yields are just on the kernel, just on the thing that we eat. But pistachios and walnuts include the shell in their yields. So when you start looking at data, what exactly are you looking at? So just to give you a sense that that's the hard part, to go from these really big picture thinking to how do we do something on a local level when, you know, how and what information is relevant. So just keep that in the back of your mind. I'll first just talk about almonds. As I say, we're only in the Central Valley. Almond acreage has increased, and we're now in the top 3 crops in value and in acreage in California. As Thomas said, it's a highly exported crop. However, the United States is still the largest market for almonds. As the export markets have increased, the consumption in the United States has increased pretty much in parallel. It's been roughly a 30-70% split for more than 20 years. It's a high value crop, which is one reason why the acreage has been increasing. It's also a crop that you don't need that much labor for. Another reason why, again, things that have nothing to do with groundwater and science. These are economic choices that affect what growers are choosing to do. And then coming back to that conversation about what's the role of ag in the U.S., California's economy, and a reminder for those of you in the rest of the world, California's economy alone is somewhere in the 9th largest economy in the world if it were just by itself. So ag is roughly, supposedly 2%, but again, it doesn't look at it. In the Central Valley, ag is the primary economic driver. That's where food is produced. It's also where food is processed. That's where your tomato paste comes from and so forth. So the way LA lives or San Francisco lives are very different from just 75 miles east of here. And culturally also quite different, to be honest with you. So just to give you some overview on where we are. Another thing that we've seen a lot is people don't understand who are these people that grow in California. And the bottom line, if you look at the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, over 91% of the farms in California, almond farms, are family farms. And nearly 3/4 of them are less than 100 acres, or less than 42 hectare. I don't have my right unit there on the hectares, sorry. But just to give you a sense of the average size. Now, we have everything from 2-3 acre growers to more than 10,000 acre growers. So there's all of that's represented. But it also gives you a sense of the diversity of an audience we have. A lot of the smaller acreage growers are people like Perry Clausen. They grow on the side. They're not just growers. They have another job. How do you reach a grower who's spending time during the day earning their money from elsewhere, in our outreach programs? And the Almond Board of California, just to briefly explain, is something called a federal marketing order. The growers get together, decide they want this to exist, and it's a way of managing themselves. They then pay an assessment to then do, in the case of the Almond Board, we do global market development, so marketing globally, that's where most of the money goes, but we also do scientific research, industry education, we set quality and food safety, food standards, and we try and keep track of regulatory issues. We can't lobby per se. And I think the other thing to realize is I, as a staffer, can cajole and recommend, but at the end of the day, it's grower money, and the growers, through the committees, make decisions for how the money that they've put in gets used across all of these areas. And I have to admit, when I was trying to figure out how to look this news article came up yesterday, drought hit California, has a bonanza of water underground. I have to admit, my first reaction was, now how the hell did Thomas get the PR for this conference in Yahoo News? With everything else going on. Then I looked at it and I went, yeah, right. I wish. So coming back to reality, and it's also an example of how the media puts something as a headline where, as a layperson, you think, okay, all of our groundwater problems have been solved. Then when you read it, you realize, no, not at all. We're still in the exact same boat we were 2 days ago before this study appeared. So the question that Thomas asked me to engage on, actually he wanted me to talk about a much larger topic. I said, Thomas, I don't know that. Is how do you engage growers towards sustainability? And this is a really large question, and for those of you who are with the Extension Service, that's what your livelihood's all about. And I also will say sometimes I wonder how many other sectors of the economy does society think they have the right to tell that sector how to do things? Maybe education's the next other one, but we don't try and tell Silicon Valley how to do things the way we try for growers. So just keep that also in the back of the mind of sort of what are our expectations here? I think the other, just a reminder in this more scientific conversation, that farming is a business. It's not a nonprofit. This is a business, okay, guys? So when we're talking to growers, you have to put it in that economic context. The choices growers are making are based on a mixture between the biological, weather, environment realities and economic questions. So, USDA Economic Research Services definition is just pretty simple. Anything that sells more than $1,000 worth of food or items is considered a farm. So when we look at sustainability's always got, people talked about the 3 Ps or the 3 Es, social equity, economically viability, and ecologically sound. You cannot forget that that economic component. If the business cannot make it, then it's not sustainable. So as we have these conversations, how do you keep that element in the mind when we have all the, both water availability and groundwater quality questions coming towards ag? So to engage on sustainability, we have to really be talking about some kind of business sense. It has to make some business sense to growers. So just, briefly, what some things we consider necessary for success, and a lot of you'll be very happy to hear, research is foundational. Without data, you cannot make progress, and you cannot make arguments for why change might be useful. It's also where new technologies come from. And then foundational, and this would make Linda Humiston happy if she were here, Thomas's supreme boss. We would not, California I mean, U.S. agriculture in general, but California agriculture in particular would not be the success story it is without that continuum of the university research and then the UC extension system, with the trust that they have built with growers over the years. Now, many times the growers don't realize that data is coming from the university because their advisors is a pest control advisor, a crop control advisor, but that PCA and CCA has sat in the farm extension meetings or gone and talked to them to get their information. So again, I cannot emphasize that having that continuum of basic to applied to extension is a really critical element to success. And the other element is you need leadership. If you want to lead change, you need to have somewhere leadership within that's trusted within that group to make that happen. I'm going to start sort of in the middle of the conversation because there's too many things going on, but one thing, when I joined the Almond Board more than 10 years ago, sustainability was already a topic of conversation within the Environmental Committee. They had come up with a definition, and I basically got the assignment by my predecessor, go figure out what to do with this. Okay. So it took me a while to sort of figure out what the options were, and where we've ended up, at least for now, is with a sustainability program that's based on grower self-assessments, where they come in and write, for an individual orchard, I'm doing something, this practice, or not doing this practice. We have 8 modules. The first 2 were irrigation and nutrients, 2 key ones for this session. Started in 2009. And at this time, we have about 18% of actual acreage somewhere assessed in the program, and that represents about 40% of the acreage. So the assessments go to an individual orchard, because you can have one orchard that's still that's on a drip, another one that might be still flood, completely different practices needed, so you can't just take the whole operation as a whole. And I mean, we're in the middle of the process of saying, okay, where next with the program? And just to explain, we have, as I say, what we ask, most of the questions are really asking XYZ practice, grower, are you doing it or not? We nuance the no into never heard of it, I've heard of it but I don't use it, or I've tried it but I don't use it, because that gives us information as to why not. It could be that it's just a question of more education, outreach, but if it's something that a lot of growers have tried and don't use it, then that means something doesn't work about that practice for them. That can be everything from it's too complicated, too expensive, to it messes with my hunting season, okay? So just to be upfront, I mean, you know, growers are humans, by the way. We all have our foibles. And the other thing that we do is the growers get then actually feedback from the program. It's not a survey, because they get feedback on how they've answered the questions relative to everybody else who's participated. So the whole idea, there's a give incentive to sort of say, hey, God, you know, I'm not doing that, but 60% of my colleagues are. Maybe that's a practice I should look into some more. So the idea is to encourage, to be honest, when you sit down and do it, you start thinking about things. It's a bit like sitting down and reviewing your life. Who wants to do that? But it is a bit of that. But in that process, it makes you think about what am I doing? Where am I? And then, as I say, they get the feedback through the reports. We have also done a first report based on the first 4 years of the self-assessment and just on 5 of the modules. I think the main thing to point out of that is we had like over 500 practices in there. How the hell do we present that? So we did an analysis of all the practices across the board, looked at what was their impact across all the media, and the ones with the most impact that were highly used are what we call like water quantity strengths. So in this case, you know, 73% of the growers are using a micro irrigation system of some kind. And then the practices with the most impact that were not widely used are so-called opportunities. So for example, less than 50% of the growers were using a real-time crop coefficient, ETC, in calculating when and how much to irrigate. So that's something that gives us an opportunity to say, okay, here's where we're doing well, here's where we need to do some outreach, or we need to do research. So the sustainability program is important to assess changes in behavior over time, which gets to where we are now. As I say, research has been foundational to the Almond Board. We have now 4 different committees that fund research. This is also true on the marketing side. It's also all about research. So the changes in production that we've seen have come, a lot of it, out of things that the Almond Board has funded. So just to give an example of where we are right now, just in the last 20 years, because of changes in the irrigation practices, the associated nutrient management practices, plus also cultural changes, planting density, we now grow 33% more crop for the same amount of water. It's not using less water, but it's a better water use efficiency, and that's just in the last 20 years. This is data coming straight out of the sustainability program. 70% of the growers are using micro-irrigation systems. Now, of course, if you listen to the water footprint world or the groundwater people, that's bad because we're not recharging anymore. But within the California thinking, it's about how much water are you using, or how well is that water being used. That's beneficial use concepts. Then this is actually a good thing. 83% of the growers use some mixture of weather data, soil moisture data, and plant water status data to determine when and how much to irrigate. So that's where we are, or been. Then the drought hit, and we became a bit of the devil incarnate. With size comes responsibility. With size, we are then taking the step back internally. This is coming back to leadership. Our CEO went to the board of directors. The board of directors accepted the challenge and said, yes, we need to step back and say, where are we? What are the challenges we face? How do we as an organization figure out where we can impact things both internally and within that larger California agriculture climate, I'll call it. So one of the key areas that came out of is something called this agriculture accelerated innovative management, where we have 4 key areas. First one, water management and efficiency, is really about how do we do better on irrigation. We're doing well, but we think we can do better. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The other one is sustainable water resources. Really what we're meaning about in the Central Valley, where we really have either surface water or groundwater. We're not using much in the way of recycled water or other water sources. So our groundwater recharge fits into that, the whole effort. We've been funding some of the work that you heard from Helen and Lawrence Berkeley Lab. Can we figure out how to do better with the water that we have in the Central Valley? And then we have air quality issues, and then we have this 22nd century agronomics, which is pretty much everything else about how to grow an almond better. So on the irrigation side, we did an analysis. We stepped back and we went to the experts and said, okay, where can we make a difference in irrigation? And I'll be honest with you, when we started that conversation, we all thought it was going to be essentially a Silicon Valley solution. It's going to be all high tech. It's all going to be, precision ag. And the more we talked to the experts in irrigation, they're like, can we just get the growers to do what we already know? And then after the third guy said that to our CEO, he came back to us staff and said, we need to make a difference here. So we sat down with the experts and said, what are the things you want every grower, and this is no almond grower, to be doing for the irrigation management? Came up with a list of 5 things. That's making sure your irrigation system is working the way you think it is. Distribution uniformity, stuff like that. I mean, growers are always making sure it's not leaking or spraying, but your assumption is that it's putting on X number of gallons per hour. If it's not, that messes up your irrigation, and it messes up your nutrient management because we put all of our fertilizers on with irrigation. That you somehow measure your applied water, at least calculate it out, better yet measure it. That you are using the crop coefficient, the ETC, in calculating your water needs, that you're monitoring soil moisture. There's currently some debate now whether it's monitor plant water status or an or. And then we said, again, I mentioned earlier, we have this very wide diversity of growers out there. We sat down and said, okay, what's the minimum standard? What's something we think any grower in our industry should be able to do, regardless of size, regardless of capitalization, that does these 5 things? So we came up with a minimum standard that we think any grower can meet without substantial investment in time or equipment. And then we have a level 2 and a level 3, which is really more refinements. Typically they involve in more investment in time or equipment to get there. We also have some talk about at planting is when you make the decision for your irrigation system, so that's another opportunity for making change, but that doesn't really fit into the yearly water management. So great, we have this idea, this continuum. Now what? We went back to the sustainability program. We went and asked the consultants, can you dig into the data and figure out which of the questions relate to these now 5 practices? How well were we doing? And that was a big aha experience. And this is where you can see where extension and private sector can make a difference. Essentially, a lot of the growers were already monitoring soil moisture or monitoring plant water status, and in some way or another. And that's partly plant water status. We have an extension specialist who's been talking about that for 15 years, every single grower meeting he goes to. So I think it started to sink in. Soil moisture, we've had a bunch of new technologies hit the market which send data to your cell phone or to your computer. And let me tell you, men and their toys, having a cell phone, having iPads, that's cool. Coming back to Perry's point, even 10 years ago, we had a board member who didn't even have a fax machine. Okay, so the assumption from academia about the access to the internet and the speed of it and so forth, be careful, that's not true, even in the United States for rural communities. But, as I say, cell phones, being able to take it out in the field has really accelerated that adoption. But then when we look at how frequently have you checked your irrigation system, not so good. It's the same question I can ask you guys. When's the last time you checked your tire pressure in your cars? Same concept. We all know it makes the car run more efficiently, but do we take the time? So that gives us a sense of the opportunities, where we need to go. And so the next thing is really, we are currently in the midst of implementing it. We have an irrigation calculator that is on our sustainability website because we figured out that there's a lot of simple calculations, but when you do it on total, they actually take quite some time. So we try to simplify that. Again, there's more intense things out in the private sector. We're doing already outreach. We are developing a one-stop shop website where all of those things in the continuum, you can find information either how to do it or where to get experts to do that. We're even hiring an irrigation specialist internally to help growers do that. And we're going to be using the sustainability program to measure. Just to let you know that Perry Clausen talked about that already yesterday. We had already been funding work on nitrogen in almonds, primarily with Patrick Brown's group at UC Davis, but there were a whole bunch of team around that. And that funding got aided by USDA, NIFA, Specialty Crop Research Initiative grant. And out of that, we really were able to refine a bunch of we found out growers weren't doing so bad, but there were refinements possible. And so we have a whole nitrogen management tool also available on our sustainability website that pulls a lot of the information together from that research. Coming back to incentives to growers, one of the incentives we've added to do this is they have to do paperwork now for the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. Not one of their favorite things to do. So the almond nitrogen tool is more detailed, encompassing than what you need to do for the Irrigated Lands Program. But you have a button on it essentially that extracts out of it what you need for that, and you have the piece of paper that you need for that part of the program. And then the other area where we're seeing things coming is from the private sector, and that is private standards. Now, I have to admit, I work a lot in the regulatory world. Regulators I will argue with. I just did it yesterday. The private sector has both the potential for making a difference, but it also can be very, very scary. I'll just be upfront with you guys, because I heard yesterday someone talking about, well, we want the private sector to talk about nitrogen footprint. First of all, who gets to decide what is sustainable? Is it good to have, just in our world, is it good to do groundwater recharge because you're using flood irrigation, or is it not? Who makes that decision? Why is it a water footprint methodology versus a life cycle assessment methodology? Or is it a nitrogen method? Or is it a greenhouse gas? Who makes those decisions? In the private sector, they make decisions based on, a lot of it's what public pressure puts on them, and that is not scientifically based, and you have no process to argue with it. So I just want to let you know these things scare the living daylights out of me. On the other hand, there are some potential for encouraging change if it's done well and in cooperation with the growers. So these are just two examples from General Mills and Mars. And we're definitely starting to see a lot more questions being asked of the almond industry that we haven't gotten before. So coming back to the question, what makes it easy? Easy is when it saves the grower money or improves their yield or quality. That's always an easy win-win. Moderate is when you need some investment, but you get improvements. The ones that are really hard to get behavior change is something that just hurts the grower, and they cannot see an economic benefit from it. And as I say, the factors you need the research, the data, you need trusted advisors, and it also helps. In the United States, we do have a USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, and in California we have some incentives that help growers get over that hurdle of the uncertainty of a new technology or the risk to implement something new. That can help. And again, just a general reminder that growers are trying to work in a very complex environment, weather-wise, biologically, regulatory-wise, and economically. We're just talking about two items in that, water availability and water quality, but a grower is functioning in that much larger world. So how do we deal with that? So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele. Perhaps while the morning panelists are working their way back up here on stage, if I could ask you all to come back, we can take one question for Gabriele.
This one right there.
Thank you, Gabriele. Excellent presentation. And my question has to do with your last slide, namely, okay, what we can see is that the growers are improving their own efficiency, and of course, with that comes many gains from water users, different water users in the society in general, say California. And my question has to do with, are you first calculating those hydrologic services from those improvements, and are you valuing those services as far as dollars, say, for water quantity and water quality type gains in the system? Thank you.
Short answer is no. Mainly for a variety of reasons, no. One is that water in California is really complicated, so two almond growers just 20 miles apart have completely different water costs because of historical reasons. I'll just put it that way. So it's really hard to say something, this is true for all almond growers, just because of that whole issue. And then the other issue is just a more fundamental one, is that in the marketplace, no one is paying more for growers to do more for the environment. No one is. You're not, I'm not. Okay? So it is really hard to see that, because when we go shopping, we're looking for either price or quality, not that whole other story. And, you know, there's certain things where some people will make buying decisions on one component, on water or on carbon or on fair trade. It's just one component of that whole sustainability picture, and so it's not really, to me, a very holistic way of thinking about things. So currently, I just haven't seen in the marketplace give the signal that they would be willing to value that savings in some way or that protection in some way.